Hikers and backpackers of Reddit. What is the weirdest or creepiest thing you have found while hiking? My friends and I found a 22-year-old girl, face down in the mud, both legs broken with compound fractures. She had no cell phone, no water, no food, and nothing to keep her warm. Her friend was dead. A little backstory: my two friends and I were hiking in a pretty popular spot in our area. It's a 150-foot waterfall that takes about 45 minutes of uphill hiking to get to. We decided to go bouldering around the bottom of the waterfall. There are various little pools and boulders where the water runs off from the waterfall. This bouldering trail is not on the main trail, and not many hikers ever veer off of the main trail. When we found her, obviously we called 911 and gave her any supplies we had. Eventually, a helicopter showed up and they flew her to the nearest hospital. Turns out she was hiking with her friend the night before when they both fell off of the waterfall. Her friend must have gone to get help, but unfortunately died less than 100 yards from where we found the girl. So no one knew she was hurt or that she was even there. It's a miracle she was still alive, and mind-blowing to think what she had gone through when we found her 20 hours later. This old woman hiker in her 70s somehow saw us in reverse order through a wormhole or something. The first time we saw her she said, "Oh, well, hello again." I just passed it off as her being old, slightly senile. Then 30 minutes later, we saw her again, and this time she just said hi as she passed us. I'm not even sure how she got there. She was going the opposite direction of us on the trail both times. The words "per audacia ad ignotum" drawn in the snow in the absolute middle of nowhere, yet no footprints around them. The words were probably a few hours old. The closest translation we could find was "through audacity towards the unknown. Took my young children to a cave not far from the house." Popular spot, but we had the place to ourselves. You can walk through it in about 30 minutes without too much difficulty. It has a tiny exit at the opposite end. It was pretty muddy, so we decided to turn around and head back to the entrance. Halfway back, there was a lit candle sitting about 8 feet up one side. It was definitely not there on the first trip. I went into full-on protective dad mode, knowing there was likely someone hiding in the dark while we walked the rest of the way out. I've spent various stretches of time backpacking and camping throughout the US and seen some strange things. My brother and I came across an abandoned trailer town, of sorts, that scared the hell out of us. We also came across a rundown town, really small, out in New Mexico that seemed to have one person living in it. We based that on the fact that there was still some food and supplies there that were fairly fresh, perhaps just a few days old. Spent a couple days there trying to find the person, just to find out why they were staying in the town. Never found a person. We found the skeletal remains of an unknown number of deer, ranging from bucks to fawn, ensnared in a barbed wire fence that encompassed a 10 by 10 area in the Ozarks. A few of the skulls topped the fence posts, and there was one post in the middle of this area that had decaying deer bodies, looked to be 2, but there were only 6 hooves jutting out of the wreckage, wrapped around it. We found a dummy hanging from a tree while in the Yukon Territory of Canada. Literally out in the middle of the woods. No reason for it, as far as we know. And we also came across a dead junkie on a road out of Olympia. Obvious OD, as he had his arm tied and a needle in hand. Eyes were glazed over and staring straight ahead, mouth slightly ajar. Me and a buddy chose some national forest in Oregon specifically for how remote it was. About a year prior, a family became lost and the father was never found, although mother and child lived to tell the tale. Anyway, we set up camp around 4 p.m. after getting pretty deep into the woods on a mountain accessed by logging roads, maybe about 100 to 200 yards from where we parked, near a lake. Without much else to do, we started a fire and cracked some beers as the sun went down. Then pickup trucks started going through the woods, slowing down when they saw our campfire. We got curious and stupid via the beers and went deeper into the woods. Seemed like a hell of a party was going on. Then we stumbled into a clearing where maybe 15 to 20 dudes were hanging around a bonfire next to a mossy run-down camper trailer. One had a pistol on his hip, another was just chillin' with a shotgun. We're like, oh shit at first, but someone approaches us and acts neighborly and invites us to have a beer, so it seemed okay. They were joking around mostly, some talking about drugs, coke, meth, but there were some older dudes that seemed pretty tense. As this happened, 4 to 5 dudes who seemed to be standing sentry at the camper, which didn't look like it had been moved in a long time, went inside for a few minutes. When they came back out, they said we were faggots and saw us making out. Pretty quickly, I got up to head back to our site, but my slower, drunker buddy took a few punches. Then he made it out and started following, and we were sprinting through the forest in the darkness, just hoping to get back to our site by spotting the glowing embers of our burned-out fire, the whole time with gun toters in tow. We found our site, and with pretty much everything in the tent, we pulled the stakes to toss it in the trunk of our car, when we hear an enraged scream only about 50 yards from us: "Kill the faggots." So we were like, fuck it, dropped the tent and gear without even saying a word to each other, and sprinted in the direction of the car. We peeled out and thought we were good, but about 30 seconds later some headlights come up from behind us, and I'm like, fuck, that's the truck that shotgun dude was chillin' at. So now we're being pursued by crazy gun-toting rednecks with a superior vehicle in unfamiliar forest on unmaintained logging roads in the dark, and the only thing we can do is speed up. I remember looking at the speedometer as we approached a washed-out hairpin turn, and it was moving from 45 to 50 miles per hour, and the truck was tailing us pretty close, like by only a couple feet, and I was pretty sure that we were gonna slide off the cliff and die. Somehow my drunk-ass buddy managed to power slide that turn and get some distance between us and the tweakers, and we eventually made it to a paved 2-lane, at which point the truck pulled off. We put it together later that the camper was a meth lab, nothing else it really could have been, deep in the forest with armed guards and sure. When out exploring an old abandoned quarry with some friends, we found this dude stood staring at this rock, occasionally twitching, but he never turned around. We were pretty creeped out, so didn't investigate, and left pretty soon after. Later on that night, we found out that another friend was driving down the lane that runs parallel to the quarry, found a guy in a black coat stood in the middle of the road, and wouldn't move. She was pretty freaked out and had to reverse all the way back up the lane in the dark because he was still there. Pretty sure it was the same guy, otherwise it was just a big coincidence. I was hiking in the Hoh rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington back in '03. I was trying to do this really snazzy hike from the ocean to Mt. Olympus. Well, day 1 is a blast, get everything accomplished. Day 2, fog. Fog as thick as anything you can imagine. I can't get a decent GPS fix, so I'm pretty much blind, but I know if I follow the Hoh River upstream, I'll get to one of the campsites I'm going for. Day goes by, and fog isn't clearing up at all. I get to a fairly big clearing and set up my tent. I grab a power bar and chill out as it starts going to the darkest black night I've ever experienced. I'm seriously a bit unnerved at the whole thing, not scared as much as just anxious. About 2 in the morning, I start hearing this huffing noise. Like Darth Vader without the helmet on. My imagination starts to go freaky, and I reach for my flashlight. I pull the drawstring on the tent a little, very quietly, and poke my head out. Still dark as death. I hear the noise coming from maybe 5 feet to my right. At this point, I'm seriously rethinking my belief in Sasquatch. I poke my flashlight out and turn it on. I'm a few feet away from a massive Roosevelt elk who'd lost his way in the dark as well. He sees the flashlight, bolts the other way, tags a tree, and knocks himself clean out. I laid in the tent until I heard a groan, a bunch of commotion, and the big guy grunt away. I was backpacking in New Hampshire and camped out for the night after a day hike. I wandered off from our fire to go take a piss and stumbled upon a circle etched into the ground with tuning forks surrounding the circle standing up straight. It looked like a creepy ritual circle, and it bugged me out, so I booked it back to the group. Neither weird or creepy. But in middle school, a bunch of friends and I were hiking when we're approached by a mute kid making the extended finger/whole motion with his hands. We're not sure what's going on, so one of my friends yells he wants to rape us. Get the knives. Afraid, we all bust out our pocket knives, and the poor kid runs back into the woods. A few minutes into the hike, we spot an amorous couple furiously getting it on inside an old VW Beetle. We think the generous mute kid just wanted to share his pervy discovery with us. But we scared him off with knives. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other, think mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a sat phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in and we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in and we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in and the waves on the lake swelled to 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky canoes. We pull off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp in rush to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. We just set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning, it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tent collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first, we were just disgusted what assholes did this. Or left their shit out to be bear food? The more we looked around though, the weirder things seemed though. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, a serious set of hiking equipment. Enough for 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. The other half was totally untouched, but thrown on the ground. Like somebody NOP'd the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First thought was bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, but nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there with half being totally destroyed and half being untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking, all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. Bushwalking in NSW, Australia, me and my friend came across this weird platform-looking thing made out of rocks. Later that year, the cops arrested some bloke on suspicion of the murders of a series of backpackers who had gone missing over the course of a few years, and at the sites of several of the murders slightly off in the bush were these altars. Current Affairs show runs footage of one, the trial and run up to it were all over the news, and yeah, it's that thing we found. The altars were typically no more than 300 yards from the victims' shallow graves. The guy who was arrested and subsequently convicted for the murders is Ivan Milat, Australia's worst serial killer. The cops are pretty sure that at least one other person was involved in the murders than the one now in jail for the crime, they just couldn't prove it. Went on a 5-day gold panning trip with a couple buddies of mine. We drove 6 hours down in used logging roads, we're talking totally overgrown roads with trees having to be removed from the road to pass. We saw not one human the entire time we were out there, except for on the 3rd night, at 3 a.m. We are sitting around the fire, drinking some beers, swatting at bugs, and shooting the shit when I hear something. I look over and notice some light in the trees. What the? It's a truck, driving up the logging road we had cleared ourselves to get there, at 3 a.m. The truck gets up to where we are, pulls into where we made camp, a small turnoff spot for logging trucks, sits there for 10 seconds while we all kinda stare in shock at one another. I get up and start walking towards the truck to say hello and ask what the heck they are doing out at 3 a.m. on abandoned logging roads when the truck just backs up, turns around, and drives off the way it came. The guys just drove 6 HRS down logging roads all through the night, sees us and leaves without saying a word. We are all sitting there going, WTF? We all figured this guy was driving down the road, getting out and coming back to kill us in our sleep. Next morning we head down the road and nothing, they didn't set up camp or anything. Just left. We figured we were likely camped out near a grow-up for one of the gangs, Hell's Angels most likely, and they were coming out to check who had come out to their spot, or they were there to pick the crop in the middle of the night. Last year, I was with a buddy of mine and we were going to do the Heart Creek Scramble in Alberta, but due to some health conditions he has it was going too strenuous to complete and we figured we'd make it an easy day and just do the simple trail. Now we're both climbers and have been to Heart Creek for rock climbing in the past and had a great time, so it wasn't a surprise to see the sporadic climbers on the mountainside as we went. Heart Creek is also pretty popular and easy for people who just want to go for a nice nature walk and maybe have picnic. Anyway, so we walked in, enjoying the day watching climbers on our way by. We saw a couple even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which means basically leapfrogging up the route. We settled in for lunch about a half hour later and left a couple hours after that. On our way back, I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, oh, someone must have lost this. I picked it up when my buddy got my attention and I looked further downstream. Both climbers, a young man, 29 or so, I learned later, and his partner were both lying the creek bed, rope and harnesses still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls, having a good time. The first reaction I had was that I remembered that there was a family right behind us, a husband and wife with a young daughter who were playing in the creek on the way down. We ran back and stopped them and explained as quietly as we could what was ahead, and before we knew it, looky-loos had come by. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RCMP officer, and so he took control of the situation. I learned later we weren't the first on scene and that the authorities had been called. It was a very quiet ride back into town that day, though. I lived in a national park by myself for 3 months. Several times when I was going back to my trailer for the day, I would hear music like a music box or an ice cream truck. It was always loud and sounded like it was coming from somewhere over my head. One day, I decided to look for the source, so I followed the dirt road past my trailer. The music continued. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer or not. I had my eyes on the trees and looked down just in time to avoid stepping on a snake. I scrambled back, but it didn't move. I realized it was dead, and it wasn't alone. There were half a dozen dead copperheads stretched out in the road, looking in the same direction. I went back to get my car because I couldn't bring myself to step over them, but by the time I got my keys, the music had stopped and I didn't hear it again. Over the years, when I have told this story, many people haven't believed me, but it's true as the sky is blue. Me and my brother were hiking out in our new backwoods. We had just moved into a new house, and we stumbled upon a small open grass field. In the center of it, there was a person with a blue jacket crouched over. We thought it was a friend of ours that we had recently met, so I ran out to meet. I did not have my glasses on, but I got pretty close enough to see that it was a grown man leaned over the carcass of a deer, stabbing it with an unsharpened stick. He looked up and saw me. I was pretty freaked out, so I turned around and yelled at my brother to run, and so we started to sprint as fast as we could back home. My dad and I were out camping in the mountains. We had set up our tents, and then we heard screams in the woods. We as black folks don't stick around to find out what's going on. So we packed up our stuff and drove to a different part. We thought it was mountains folks eating people or something. We drive down by the store and told the clerk that we heard screams. Turns out it was an orgy for people who dress up in animal costumes. He was telling us that they have been doing this for years.